I want to turn it over to Jaisal. Thank you so much for being with us. Jaisal is the Democracy Cohort Manager, what a cool title, at Solutions Journalism Network. And he does training and support for a range of newsrooms that have democracy programs. He's also a longtime reporter. He spent a dozen years reporting on politics, housing, public education, and criminal justice, which is an amazingly wide portfolio, Jaisal. And he's been at The Atlantic, Democracy Now!, The Real News Network, Baltimore Beat, Progressive Magazine, and Yes Magazine. But one of the reasons we wanted to invite Jaisal today is because Supreme Court coverage, of course, is so incredibly divisive, so incredibly partisan, and so upsetting for so many audiences from what we hear. And so you have, liberals reacting to every Supreme Court decision with a combination of, rage or despair. And you have conservatives being very triumphalist, at least until last week, and, sort of always planning on the next Supreme Court decision. So our question is, how do reporters kind of get beyond that and cover this in a nonpartisan manner, but also in a way that doesn't cause audiences to just turn off and switch off? What is the way forward? So with that, let me turn it over to you, and thank you again for being with us.
Yeah, hi everybody, my name is Jaisal. Great to be with you today. This is the first time I've got to do a training in person since the pandemic, so this is a really big, fun occasion for me. I have like a brief presentation, and then there's time for a Q&A, but if there's anything in the presentation that's confusing, or if you have a question, please just raise your hand or just call out. I want this to be interactive. I guess before we start, has anyone here heard of solutions journalism, or do you have an idea of what that is? A couple people? Okay. So Solutions Journalism Network is a nonpartisan nonprofit that encourages the media to focus on reporting on responses to social problems and not just problems in itself. And I'll explain a little bit about that. But one analogy that one of our co-founders uses is that if you are raising a child and you only tell the child what they're doing wrong and never tell them where they have opportunities for growth, that child's worldview is going to be really skewed, right? They're gonna only think that they embody all the negative things and not think about how they can grow or how they can improve. And so that's sort of like an analogy I really like, because if you look at media in general, and especially reporting on elections and democracy, people know about the problems, but they know less about what's being done to address those problems. And we believe that one way to strengthen democracy is to give people the tools they need to be active participants in democracy. And so I have a brief presentation to share with you guys today. So we're going to talk about solutions journalism. Solutions journalism is, and I'll talk about this more, but it's not like, when I'm talking about puff pieces, we're not talking about like profiles of people, of individuals, but it's rigorous fact-based reporting. And I'll talk more about that. I'll talk about why cover democracy with the solutions lens, especially after Election Day. I know the votes are still being counted. I know you guys probably haven't gotten a lot of sleep the last couple weeks, but there's a lot, even after the elections are over, there's still a lot of great reporting to be done. And I know Supreme Court is a topic that's going to get a lot of attention this year, and then we'll have time for lots of audience Q&A. So if you have like a general question, maybe hold it to the Q&A, but if you have a question about what I'm talking about, feel free. If you're if I'm going too fast, if I'm being confusing, just don't hesitate to raise your hand. So why cover democracy with the solutions lens? So solutions journalism does take a little more time and resources than traditional reporting. So why do it? It's more work in a lot of cases. As was alluded to before, we have a problem with democracy, right? And a problem with media. Just 1 in 4 Americans generally trust the media. Nearly 40% of Americans sometimes avoid the news. They feel it's overly negative, it's depressing. I found myself doing this. I don't follow the news as much as I used to because I sort of know it's going to be about some horrific thing happening in the world, and I'm looking out for my own personal mental health, and that is a growing problem that studies have shown that more and more people are turning off are turning off to news. So what can we do about it as the media, as reporters? So one study found that solutions-focused reporting on the threats to elections, including cybersecurity, voter purges, and aging voting machines, was more likely to leave readers feeling enthusiastic about voting and less anxious, sad, or angry than stories that simply describe the threat. So if we can report on what people can do about the problems, then you feel people leaving, you have people feeling empowered and, have the resources and tools to do something about it. So this isn't advocacy, it's not PR, it's rigorous fact-based reporting, but on the responses to social problems. So that's my next slide. And so we have 4 pillars of solutions journalism that we've developed over the last 10 years. And so we haven't there's no copyright on the term solutions journalism. We're not saying this is the only way to do solutions journalism. What we are saying is that generally solution stories have these 4 components. It's like baking a cake. If you leave out one ingredient, it's probably not going to come out right. So, and I'll have so I can share this presentation with you all. And at the end, there's a PDF where it has those 4 pillars written out, where you can take notes if you're doing solutions reporting. So the majority of solution stories focus on the response, and oftentimes reporting focuses on a problem, but solutions reporting is different because we want for solution stories to focus on the response to the problem. And so, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, but essentially, in an ideal solution story, the response is 90% of a problem. And that's not going to fit for every story because sometimes there's more context that needs to go into it, but that's generally makes a good solution story. We need evidence. So evidence about why the solution is working or it isn't. And I'll talk about evidence later. There's all kinds of evidence you can use. I mean, you guys are reporters, you understand qualitative, quantitative evidence. Another aspect is insight. How can you want to make it explicit. How is this information useful to your community or other communities? How can people use this information? How is it relevant to their own lives? And I'll talk about some examples later. And then the limitations. So this is what makes solution journalism different than PR. You're not giving people, you're not promoting an idea. You're explaining what the flaws are with this response. What limits it? What can it do? And so that's what really distinguishes solutions journalism from PR or advocacy journalism. Examining the response, not promoting it. All right, so I have some, and so we have any questions so far? Okay, so I have some examples of some recent solution stories that I'll sort of explain, and then we'll go from there. But so this recent piece actually came out of a fellowship we're doing. It's called the Democracy SOS Fellowship. It's in partnership with Harkin and Trusting News. About 21 newsrooms around the country are taking part in this program, and we basically have supported them all year in doing solutions reporting and a host of other kinds of reporting. And so this story was published a few weeks ago, actually November 2nd, before the election, responding to the Republican gubernatorial candidate's proposal to purge voting rolls in Pennsylvania. And so the story was looking at why, and based on false claims of voter fraud, which have not been proven in Pennsylvania. And so this story looked at what's actually working, because though there was no voting fraud, no wide-scale voting fraud in Pennsylvania, but really the story really explains what the state of Pennsylvania does to keep voting rolls secure. So examining the response to possible voter fraud, looking at the evidence, and I think several 100,000 people had been removed from the voting rolls for either having moved or having passed away in the last few years. That was an example of the evidence they used, along with the fact there has been no widespread voter fraud. And I think some of the limitations in the story were that there's not one central database that election officials can use to go to keep track of if people are moving or if voters have passed away to clear those voting rolls. So this was a really good example of solutions journalism focused on democracy. And we've also found that obviously, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories around elections. And if you have to debunk a conspiracy theory, you're already kind of too late. And so these kind of stories help pre-bunk conspiracy theories because they actually explain how these systems work and why elections are secure and what, if there are flaws, what those flaws are. Another example that came out of our fellowship from Wisconsin Watch, which talks about, so this is an example of a story of who's doing it better. So in Wisconsin, it's a state with, like in Milwaukee, a very high incarceration rate. A lot of people in prison cannot vote, but thousands of them are legally allowed to, but they lack the ability to do so. And so this team of reporters in Wisconsin looked at 2 best practices in Illinois and Texas and examined how those states in certain counties are doing voter registration drives. I think in Illinois, it's one of the only places that has a polling place in a prison to help people that are incarcerated get to the polls and vote. And so, and some of the limitations in this story, and so some of the evidence, I'll start with the evidence. The evidence was that since they started in-person voting drives in counties in Texas and Illinois, hundreds of people that were not registered were able to get registered, and the turnout in the jail increased by like 70%. Some of the limitations, so, that was happening in Texas and Illinois, but some of the limitations in Wisconsin were that not every jail had like protocols or rules on how this type of program could be implemented. So there was still limitations on getting the lessons from Texas and Illinois being applied in Wisconsin. Another story, this wasn't supported through a fellowship, but another story that is a great example of solutions journalism. This was April 2020, pandemic hit. The primaries are starting. How can people vote safely if they can't go to the polls, if they can't leave their homes? Utah had a great example the country learned from. Mail-in voting, being able to vote from home. Several states had already started it. Utah was an example of how to make it work. They were able to do it. They had lessons to teach. And so Eric Cordelesa from the Washington Monthly did this great piece about how to save elections from the pandemic, how to make elections work despite this historic pandemic. So, he talked about the limitations from it. There's evidence on voter turnout. I think in Utah, even in the Republican primary, turnout increased something like 40% after they had universal vote by mail. And then, solutions journalism can be accountability journalism. And so this is an example of, comparing, rhetoric around voting by mail by an actual red state that's embraced it. And, there were very few isolated instances of voter fraud, and vote by mail doubled GOP turnout. So, that's accountability based on what actually happened in Utah. And so I have a little pop quiz if I can get any volunteers. So it's solutions journalism if it features not just a person, but a blank to a systemic problem and how it happens. Any ideas what goes in the blank? Yeah, exactly. A response to a social problem, a response to a systemic problem and how it happened. And if it's solutions journalism, if it provides available blank of results, looking at blank, not just intentions. Any idea? Right. Provides available evidence of response. And any ideas of what can go? And there's not just like one answer, but any ideas what can go in the second blank? Outcome. Yep, that totally works. Outcomes, efficacy, not just intention. So it's not, I'll go into this in a second, but it's not just an intention of doing something. It's like we want actual evidence. It's a solution story. There's actual evidence you can point to look at whether that response was effective and where it failed. And so here's some questions, and I'm going to share this deck with you all, so you'll have this, but some questions for solution stories, and these are just good questions in general to be asking. How does response work? What metrics matter? Who is the response not working for? What does the research say? What do critics say? And I find that that's just a great question to be asking in general. You know, what is the criticism? What is the best criticism of your work, right? That's generally just an awesome question to ask. Is it being replicated elsewhere? If someone is involved in a response to a social problem in their community, more likely than not, they're going to know where that kind of response is being implemented elsewhere. And what are the barriers to replication? What are the unique scenarios happening in a community that might prevent it from being replicated elsewhere? So another quiz for you guys. I'll give you guys a second to read these headlines. One of these is a solution story and one is not. I'll give you guys a second to read the headlines. If we have any volunteers on which one is a solution story, or if there's no volunteers, I'll just call on somebody.
The right one on the right.
Go ahead.
The one on the right.
Why?
Examining a potential plan of action or a way to move beyond a problem.
Perfect. Exactly, right? That's great. Yeah, so it's not just about what's wrong. It's not just about what's, you know, especially when you're talking about the communities that are most impacted by social problems. They don't need, like, I live in Baltimore. No one in Baltimore needs to read like an article about a 5,000 word article about violence in Baltimore, right? Like, they live that every day. They want to know what can be done about it.
Do they like based on the clicks? Like, you know that
Right, and so good point, right? That might get more clicks, but what we have found, what some of the research has found, is that article might get more clicks, but guess what article has longer page views? The article that's about the problem, or an article about the solution that no one's heard about?
So there's an actual metric that we use to compare that instant
Yeah.
Do you know whether or not the instant version
Yeah, so there is some, I don't think I have the research handy with me, but I can definitely follow up. There is research that shows that solution stories have longer page views, and also it's a way for newsrooms to build stronger relationships with communities, and also it's been a tool to raise revenue, because the newsrooms have been able to translate solution stories to increasing donations and funding in a real way. And so I don't know if I have that. That's a great question, and I don't know if I have that handy, but I can definitely follow up and share that with you guys. And so we have a solution story tracker that has, I think, over 14,000 stories. And if you go to our website, solutionsjournalism.org, you can search. We just upgraded our search function, so it works really well. But I thought it'd be interesting to share why stories don't make it into the tracker, why they're not considered solutions. They might be great stories, but don't quite fit our criteria. The top reason is no evidence yet exists. So we need to have evidence. And if you're doing a story just on a proposal and you don't have evidence on how it's being implemented elsewhere, that's not a solution story. And it needs compelling evidence. So if the story is just raising awareness about a response, and it doesn't include any evidence beyond that awareness, then it's not a solution story. And there's a difference between evidence of the problem and evidence of the solution. And so that is something that people often get stuck on. And oftentimes there won't be limitations, and that's what differentiates it from a puff piece.
So I'll turn it over to questions in just a second. I just have one Supreme Court related question for you, just because we're about to go to the court. Yeah. I mean, the Supreme Court is uniquely beyond our control, both for citizens and advocates in some ways, and also for journalists, in the sense that, you know, you can't go interview a Supreme Court justice and just ask them, hey, what's the evidence for your decision? What are your thoughts about how to take, in the broadest sense, how to take a solutions-based approach to covering the court or to the response to court decisions?
That's a really good question. I would say, in general, the best solution stories talk to the people that are most impacted. So, if there's a Supreme Court case on, what's an example of a Supreme Court case that's happening?
Affirmative action's coming up this
Yeah,
term, right?
affirmative action, right? So, I feel like a good solution story would talk to the people that are most impacted by affirmative action and see, what the evidence is, right? Has it worked? Has it lived up to the intention and the goal? And look at the evidence for and against it, because affirmative action was a response to a social problem, right? And so you can evaluate the effectiveness and the efficacy of affirmative action, look at the limitations, and just really look at the evidence and see what the insights are and what has it been tried elsewhere? Has there been affirmative action in other places? I think that would really work, and you don't necessarily need to interview the people in power to do solution stories. I think you can really look at the people that are directly impacted, if that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Questions?
So I know there are some papers around the country. I know the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson, at least, they've been starting to add solutions reporters to kind of their staff. I guess, what has been your all's pitch for that? Have you had involvement in kind of grants and making this happen? I guess, what is your work? Can you tell us more about your work with, I guess, local newsrooms to kind of expand this concept and add more kind of staff around the country?
Yeah, we work with dozens of newsrooms around the country. So I'm working with about 24, but we have dozens of more around the country, and I can't even name like half of them. But we have local initiatives, like regional initiatives. We're working with J schools. There's international work, but like I was saying, especially local papers have found that they're facing revenue shortfalls. They have to do 10,000 journalists have lost their jobs in the pandemic. They found that so one example is, if you're just there when things are going wrong, that's a really hard way to build trust, right? But if you can also be there when things are going right and shine a light on that community to show what's working and where they're succeeding, you can build a relationship that's totally different than if you're only there for when people are dying, or there's bodies on the ground, or there's like police tape marking off a neighborhood. And a number of newsrooms have been able to translate that into revenue generation, into community partnerships. There's, I'm trying to think of the paper, I think maybe in Cleveland. So we're not the only tool. Like, we work with a variety of other newsrooms, a variety of other organizations, but there's I think it was maybe in Cleveland, a paper actually created a community advisory board, like a paid community advisory board that were ambassadors for the paper, and were out in the community getting sources, learning about solutions, and then so that went to the newsroom, and that gave a way to tell the stories that sometimes get missed in traditional reporting. But yeah, great question, and I will share that research about revenue generation, about views on social media and clicks and stuff, because that's some really interesting stuff that I was actually a skeptic of myself when I started, but they've got some really good evidence to back it.
Thanks for being here today. I'm Kurt Beta with National Journal. What are some of the pushback that you have when you're approaching newsrooms about adopting a more solutions-based approach? What are some of the barrier to entries you have, and how do you guys overcome those?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people, so it's different, right? Journalists have been doing, their thing for a long time, and it's easy to get in a rhythm, and it's easy to sometimes it's easy to sort of feel like your work, your work stands for itself, right? You don't need anyone to you don't need me to come in and tell you how to do things differently. But I think, yeah, and so a lot of times people, I think the top critique of it is that it's advocacy, or it's like PR. But I think by focusing on limitations, by focusing on evidence, solutions journalism, I think it's a pretty strong case to say it's not PR, it's not advocacy, it's rigorous reporting. And yeah, I mean, the traditional formula, it bleeds, it leads, right? That is a formula that's been there for a long time. But we really want to look at the broader picture and what impact that's having for our democracy, right? Is that the healthiest way is that the best thing for our democracy? And is that the best thing for communities to only know about what's going wrong? And we found that by doing this as a part of a bigger program with having more community input, having transparency in terms of what your newsroom is about, like why it's covering the stories it's covering, and doing solutions journalism, it can have a real transformative approach into in media's relationship with the community.
Have you found that it's easier to make a relationship with either nonprofit newsrooms or startups other than like big chain newspapers, like something off an offshoot of like Gannett, McClatchy, or Lee?
Yeah, great question. So some of our biggest partners are like the Texas Tribune and the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. So these big newsrooms, and they also have more resources to do it, but like the executive editor of Texas Tribune, Sewell Chan, is a big advocate of solutions journalism, and especially in a place like Texas, in a place like Wisconsin, right? People know about the problems, like gun violence, mass shootings, right? People know, and if it kind of positions them in a unique way where people can go to, because everyone's talking about problems, right? But if you can be the ones talking about solutions and what people can do about those problems, it puts you in a unique position that other newsrooms are catching up to now.
Thank you.
I'm Candace. I work for the 19th, and I think our reporters have partnered with you all on some stuff. I guess I'm curious because I know that evidence of a response is a key part of this, but there isn't always oftentimes there's not a lot of like action or even like, I don't know if you're thinking evidence even in terms of like research that's been done on a particular thing. I guess I'm wondering, like, does that just mean it's dead, or like you're
I have a slide for that.
Oh, okay, cool.
So we have, there's a, so actually, can you talk a little more about what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, just like if there's a problem, there's a problem,
Yeah.
but there hasn't been enough investment in terms of trying to develop a particular response, like in any state, or even research on a particular issues. I think a lot about like, even I like to cover criminal justice issues, and that's like pretty abysmal sometimes, the data collection and reporting on that. So sometimes I feel like it's overwhelming when you know that there's maybe something there to cover, but maybe not a lot of data or whatever.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I would say, there's all kinds of research, and so these are some examples. There's data collected by the people involved. So you're talking about criminal justice. So we have an organization in Baltimore called Safe Streets. They're violence interrupters, and they go into communities and help. They're like formerly incarcerated people that go and help stop beefs before they escalate. And so for a while, there wasn't a lot of hard quantitative data, but there's other kinds of data available. That's not the only kinds of data. So the solution story tracker is a great way, because no matter what the problem is, I can almost put like $100 on another community that's also, there's no real problem in America that's unique to one community. There's like 5,000 counties and cities and counties in this country. Some other county that's experiencing that problem has tried something, and it might be a failed effort, but there's lessons to learn from that. So the solution story tracker on our website is a great place to go. But especially for criminal justice, a lot of other countries like, I feel like there's a lot to learn from other countries too. Like I was just in Amsterdam this summer reporting on safe injection sites, and they've been around in other countries for decades. And like in Amsterdam, in Holland, there's virtually no overdose deaths. The United States had 100,000 last year, right? So there's evidence that something is working. And I spent a couple weeks talking to the practitioners in that space. And New York just opened up a safe injection site last year. So there's things that are happening, and even so even if there's not a response in the United States, there's other countries that are dealing with it, dealing with those similar problems. And if there is no like research, there's still stories, right? Communities are the foremost experts in their own experiences, right? That is also evidence. That's if there is like research, there's a peer-reviewed paper, great. But if there's not, that's not to discount people's lived experiences. And I think that is extremely valuable too.
Thank you.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm going to share this deck, so you guys will have have all this stuff.
Hi there, my name is Rachel. I work with STAT and I cover like kind of healthcare issues. So I was wondering how you advise reporters, because it sounds like these responses take a little bit of time to mature after kind of like a new problem bubbles up.
Yes.
And I think there's a tendency like in so many of our newsrooms to like follow the news cycle. It moves so fast, there's so much happening. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or best practices to kind of like loop back to some of these stories after, kind of the initial kind of wave is over of kind of awareness of a problem.
Great question. Yeah. And so one thing that I always recommend doing is if you are doing a story about an initiative launching, like a new healthcare initiative launching in a town or a city, you already have the contacts, right, in place. You've talked to the people that are going to be implementing it. Put a reminder in your phone, 3 months in, 6 months in, 12 months in. Go back to those sources, right? They're going to have to produce reports. They're going to have to produce data. And you can take a look at that data and see what that data shows. And you're going to have contacts with the people, on the front lines of that response. And maybe the data tells one story, and then you can get another part of the story talking to the actual practitioners of what's happening. And another way to do it too is look at how it's working elsewhere, because maybe this program just started recently in one town, but they've been doing it for 3 years in a different town, right? So you can look at what that evidence shows and what they've learned and what the lessons are that are transferable to your community. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it.
Hi, Jimena Bustillo with NPR. I guess I'm a little curious what you would consider the difference between what you're describing versus any other investigative or enterprise story that we might do in our newsrooms.
Yeah, I think solutions journalism is good journalism. It's basically investigative journalism. So it's not. A lot of times reporters do solutions journalism to our criteria without even realizing it. So this is just a formula of best practices for people that are trying to get into it. But that's not to say we don't have a monopoly. We're not saying this is the only way to do it. But it generally is it's generally a good way to do reporting. But so the difference might be that you might do an investigative piece uncovering a problem, and that might be the problem story, right? But a solution story would be focused on the response to that, or what is in place to change that problem. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So if you're uncovering a problem, that's a problem focused story. But if you are looking at what's being done to challenge that problem, then that's the solution story.
Okay.
And sometimes they can be the same thing, but generally solution stories are more focused on the response and looking at the evidence and the efficacy.
Okay.
Generally 90% of the story is about the response rather than the problem.
Okay. Yeah.
But if you're doing a package of stories, solution stories go really go well hand in hand with problem. And there's a great example. I think the Cleveland Plain Dealer did a story, and so a lot of solutions reporting is just showing people a different ways possible. So Cleveland had a huge problem with lead poisoning in the water there, and it was just it just became this thing that became accepted. Like, we're going to have massive amounts of lead poisoning. And then the Cleveland Plain Dealer did this investigative series looking how Buffalo remediated their lead. And so they're able to show that it is possible to do it in a better way. And that, it's accountability journalism, because you can show people in power that it is possible to fix this problem. Like, other places have done it, and this is how they did it. And so yeah, it is essentially accountability journalism, and it's had some really powerful impacts.
And sorry, Daniel Dorsch with the Kansas City Star again. So when you're talking about the kind of packages, so are you advocating to kind of center the solution instead of the problem, right? So like if you're doing a package on your Sunday front page,
Yeah.
you're gonna lead with one and not lead with the other. So is the advocacy here that the solution is the one that we should be prioritizing over the problem?
Yeah, I mean, we never suggest. We're not in the position of trying to tell any newsroom how to prioritize, what to prioritize editorially, but we do think that solutions should get as much attention as problems. Like, if you don't have that balanced perspective, then people are gonna not get the full story. So yeah, not to say you need to prioritize one or the other, but there should be a level of balance. Yeah, and to be clear, like, we don't have any editorial input on any. There's like a clear firewall between that. But we do offer suggestions, offer training, offer feedback, and actually, so this, if you guys are interested in doing solutions journalism, this spreadsheet is like a really handy guide to getting a start, because you need to have all these things identified. And you guys will get a copy of this, but a great place to start is evidence. If you don't have evidence, it's not going to be a solution story. But if you have evidence, that's a great place to start, because once you have evidence, you can put everything else together.
Yeah, I've noticed when I've done solutions journalism too, it almost doesn't let the politicians get off with things, because you can say, sometimes you arrive at the problem and everybody says, this is a really big problem and we're doing our best with the resources, possible, but, we're doing our best. Do you find that the people you work with, have more impact, like public officials are more open to changing, whatever the problem is, or approaching it another way? Or, I don't know, do you have any quantifiable like evidence on, newsrooms going a certain direction, solutions journalism direction, and then finding good results or response from public officials, or any examples?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. If as a journalist, and as a newsroom, you can point to where things are, where they've managed to figure out these problems. I think, oftentimes politicians are thankful, because they might not have heard of it, right? We tend to be so siloed in our communities that we don't necessarily know that other communities are facing these same problems and have found solutions to them. So I think it's a public service, and you're holding government officials accountable. You're empowering communities to know that they're not the only ones facing this problem, and there are tools at their disposal that they can engage in. And yeah, absolutely. And so I mentioned the example of the lead poisoning with the Cleveland Plain Dealer. There's been some great solutions around criminal justice, great solutions around harm reduction, public schools. Education coverage tends to be very negative, but if you're talking about what's working, that engages a whole nother range of people that are interested in uplifting public schools and educational outcomes. And yeah, I think like I was saying, one of the biggest problems is that we're so siloed in our own communities. We don't understand that we are we're really, a lot of these problems are national. And if you're experiencing something in your neighborhood, chances are someone else has been through the same thing, and there's stuff you can learn from them. And not every lesson is, translatable or transferable, but there's always things that things to gain from examining those lessons. Yeah, great questions.
So Jessica, can I bring you back to evidence?
Yeah.
I think most reporters, certainly reporters in news organizations like your own, probably get many press releases a day. How many do you get a day? Can you even count them? I mean, 100, 1,000. 100 is okay. So my anecdotal and ill-informed sense of this is there's a lot of press releases that are peddling hope in some form.
Yeah.
It's a new drug. It's a new program. It's a new politician's pet rock solution that they're peddling, right? So it's not that there aren't solutions out there, but so many of the solutions that are being peddled, right, are basically, yes, we're peddling hope instead of despair, but we're also peddling hope with little evidence. And, from the point of view, back to your point, Rachel, about people are on deadline and there's a, premium on covering breaking news. You started out by saying that solutions journalism is time consuming. So how do reporters deal with this? Because they're being sent, evidence, but often low quality evidence or really quite biased evidence. And how do they carve out the time to find out if they're basically being peddled, false hope or hooey?
Great question. So, yeah, I mean, I'd say that is like the job of a journalist, right? To discern, like you are taking the information you're being fed, and it's your job to fact check it, to look at other resources, look at studies, call up people that are directly impacted by those problems. And yeah, solutions journalism doesn't necessarily always work on a deadline, because yeah, I guess it is more work, but there are ways to incorporate it. Especially if you're developing a beat, and you're familiar with the research and the topics, and so when there is a proposal in your community, if you know sort of where to turn, and that's why I think it's great to develop beats. Like my first beat was public education. You're familiar with the data, and you have sources you can call, and a great place to look is our solution story tracker, 14,000 stories from around the world. It's an easy way to find where that proposal has been tried elsewhere, and did it work? Was it a false solution or was it a real one? And did it move the needle? And I think, yeah, that is ultimately the job of the journalist. But we have resources to make that easier. And I'm happy to share my email if you guys ever are stuck on something or face that problem. I'm happy to help out when I can. But yeah, I think that is really where solutions journalism can really shine, by being a lens where you can look at those solutions that people are peddling and see whether they actually are effective or not, and whether they're a false promise, right? And or it's a distraction from an actual real solution. I hope that answered your question.
So you said there were a couple of organizations that do this, that it's not just your nonprofit. Do you know how many are out there? I mean, how common is this kind of effort at the advocacy level?
Yeah, so we work with a few organizations, like Harkin. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Harkin and Trusting News. They do so we're part of a broader ecosystem where we're supporting newsrooms that want to do journalism a little differently. And we've been around for 10 years, so we're at the stage now where we're trying to step back from we're trying to support other organizations that are sort of like the front line of promoting solutions journalism and other sort of transformations. But there's definitely a big ecosystem. And if you go to our website, we link to a lot of the groups that are doing similar ecosystem work. And I'll follow up with links and resources. But yeah, it is definitely a growing movement. Yeah, definitely. And especially, I think the last few years have sort of highlighted the need for that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. News burnout is real.
Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. And do you want to just flip to your email? We'll send it around, but I just want you all to have it before. It's in the channel as well. Thanks. It's on the agenda. It's on the agenda, but just in case you have questions.
Feel free to email me questions if you have. If you are stuck on a solution story, I'm happy to help do what I can.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.